My name is Victoria Crane. I'm 76 years old, and 3 months ago, I discovered my husband was planning my death with his lover, his best friend David. But here's the thing that still makes me laugh. After 18 years of marriage, Richard had no idea who he'd actually married. He thought I was Victoria Crane, retired legal secretary, sweet, harmless, a little naive maybe, just an old widow living on a modest pension, waiting to die so he could finally inherit everything and run off with the man he really loved. What Richard didn't know, what he never bothered to ask in 18 years, was that I was actually the Honorable Victoria Crane, federal judge, 41 years on the bench, specializing in matrimonial fraud cases. And every single asset he thought he'd inherit, protected in legal structures I'd built long before I ever met him. I heard him on the phone at 2 in the morning, whispering to David, "She's just an old secretary. She has no resources to stop us. When she finally dies, we inherit everything." That's when I knew. My husband wasn't just betraying me, he was counting down the days until my death like it was a retirement plan. The worst part, he had no idea he was sleeping next to one of the most respected legal minds in the country. A woman who'd spent decades destroying men exactly like him in court. This is the story of how I let my husband believe he was married to a helpless old woman for 18 years, and how I used every single day of that deception to build the perfect trap. It's a long story, and it gets darker before it gets better, but I promise you, the ending is worth it. This is a complicated journey, and I could really use someone to walk through it with me. If you want to make sure you hear how this all plays out, consider following along with the stories shared here. That way, you won't miss what happens when Richard finally learned who his wife really was. I met Richard Winters 18 years ago at a grief support group for widows and widowers. I was 58, 2 years after losing James, my first husband. Richard was 53, charming in that quiet, unassuming way that makes you feel safe. He had kind eyes and this gentle voice when he talked about losing his wife to cancer. We were two broken people trying to find solid ground again. Looking back now, I can see how carefully he played it, how he positioned himself as the wounded romantic, the devoted husband still mourning his lost love. He'd bring coffee to the meetings, always remembered everyone's names, always had a tissue ready when someone broke down crying. He seemed like exactly what I needed, someone who understood loss, who wouldn't rush me, who just wanted companionship in the second half of life. He told me he was an independent financial consultant, managing a small portfolio of clients. Nothing flashy, he said, but it kept him comfortable. He drove a decent car, dressed well enough, always picked up the check at dinner. I had no reason to doubt him. What I didn't tell Richard, what I didn't tell anyone in that group, was what I'd actually done for a living. When people asked, I smiled and said I'd worked in a law office for many years. Technically true. I'd worked in courtrooms for 41 years, just not as a secretary. But after decades watching marriages implode over money in my courtroom, I'd learned to be careful. James had left me very well provided for, and I'd seen too many second marriages turn into financial bloodbaths. So I let Richard assume. I never corrected him when he started referring to me as a former legal secretary. I never mentioned the $6.5 million James had left me, or the pension that paid me $180,000 a year, or the properties I owned in 3 different states. I kept everything in separate trusts, accounts Richard never saw. Our home, I'd bought it with cash before we even met. The deed had only my name on it. Richard contributed what I now realize were token amounts. He'd pay for groceries sometimes, cover dinners out, handle small bills. I paid the big stuff, property taxes, insurance, our vacations, but I made it look like we were living on my modest pension, like we had to budget carefully. And Richard believed it. For 18 years, he believed we were just scraping by on an old secretary's retirement income. I met David Chun about 3 years into our marriage. Richard introduced him as his best friend from college, recently divorced, going through a rough time. David was dramatic, emotional, always touching Richard's arm when they talked, always calling at odd hours, needing something. I remember the first time I saw them together, really saw them at a barbecue in our backyard. The way David looked at Richard, the way Richard's whole face changed when David walked into a room. I asked Richard about it once, carefully. He laughed it off immediately, told me I was imagining things, said David was just affectionate because of his Italian mother. That's how he was with all his friends. He made me feel foolish for even suggesting it. so I buried the suspicion. I told myself I was being paranoid, that not everything was a conspiracy, that maybe after 41 years of seeing the worst in people professionally, I needed to learn to trust again. I buried it for 15 years. Then came that night 3 months ago. I woke up at 2 in the morning, and Richard wasn't beside me. The bathroom light was off. I lay there listening, and I heard his voice drifting up from downstairs, quiet, careful, the kind of whisper you use when you're terrified of being caught. I got out of bed, silently. 41 years on the bench teaches you how to move without making a sound. I crept to the top of the stairs, and that's when I heard the words that changed everything. Richard was in his study, door half closed, and he was saying he loved someone, not me. He was saying it to David, telling him to be patient, that it wouldn't be much longer now, that I was 76 years old. How much time could I possibly have left? When I finally died, he said, they'd inherit everything, sell this house, and finally live the life they'd been waiting for. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it from downstairs, but I kept listening. That's when Richard said the words that still make me smile. She doesn't suspect anything. She's just an old retired secretary with no resources to stop us. My lawyer already confirmed that as her husband, I automatically inherit everything. We just need patience, love, just a little more patience. I stood there at the top of those stairs, in the darkness, and something strange happened. The heartbreak I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt something else rising up inside me, something cold and sharp and perfectly focused. Because in that moment, I realized my husband had made the kind of mistake I'd seen destroy 1,000 men in my courtroom. He'd underestimated me completely. The next morning, I made Richard breakfast like I had for 18 years. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, orange juice. He kissed my cheek before leaving for his supposed client meeting, told me he'd be home by 6. I smiled and told him to have a good day. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. 41 years on the federal bench teaches you how to keep a mask in place even when your world is collapsing. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I called Martin Cosway. Martin had been a federal prosecutor for 32 years. We'd worked together on hundreds of cases, complex fraud schemes, marriage conspiracies, financial manipulation. He knew how I thought, how I worked, and most importantly, he knew when I was calling with something serious. I didn't even say hello. Just stated exactly what I needed. I told him I needed my trusts reviewed immediately, and my husband investigated. Martin, bless him, asked exactly one question: did I feel safe in my home? When I said yes, he simply replied that he'd have preliminary information within 48 hours. I spent those 2 days acting like nothing had changed. I cooked Richard's favorite meals. I laughed at his stories about difficult clients. I even suggested we invite David over for dinner soon. Said I felt bad for not being warmer to Richard's oldest friend. Richard looked so pleased, so relieved. He probably thought he'd been worried over nothing all these years. While I smiled and played the devoted wife, my mind was working through every case I'd ever presided over. I knew the patterns. I knew how these schemes worked. And I knew that what I'd overheard was just the visible tip of something much deeper. Martin called on day 3. He asked if I could come to his office alone. I told Richard I had a dentist appointment. Sitting across from Martin in his downtown office, surrounded by law books that felt like old friends, I watched him open a file that would destroy the last 18 years of my life. His face was grim in a way I'd only seen a few times in 3 decades of working together. Richard Winters wasn't a financial consultant. He was a failed insurance salesman who'd been fired from 3 different companies for ethics violations. His current income was maybe $40,000 a year, mostly from sporadic sales to people who didn't know better. And he was drowning in $87,000 across 11 different credit cards, all hidden in accounts I'd never seen. But that wasn't the worst part. Martin slid another document across his desk. Richard and David had been together romantically for 23 years. They'd started their affair while Richard was still married to his first wife, Patricia. She'd died of cancer without ever knowing her husband was living a double life. David had been at her funeral, holding Richard's hand, playing the supportive best friend, while they both counted down the days until they could be together openly. Except they never could be together openly, because David was still married to, bleeding his own wife dry in a divorce that had dragged on for years. The two of them had been waiting, planning, looking for their big break. That's when they found me. A widow, Older, alone, no children, no close family. Richard had seen me as the perfect mark, the path to the comfortable life he'd always wanted but never earned. I sat there staring at documents that proved my entire marriage was a calculated lie. And I still wasn't prepared for what Martin showed me next. He pulled out printed emails, recent ones, from the last 6 weeks. Richard and David had been discussing how much longer they'd have to wait for nature to take its course. David had apparently been getting impatient, frustrated with how healthy I was for 7. One email made my blood run cold. Richard had written back saying maybe they needed to consider helping things along if I made it past 80. Martin opened another file. Richard had been researching my heart medication online. He'd looked up dosage information, interaction effects, how much would constitute an overdose. He'd searched for symptoms of heart attacks in elderly women. He'd visited forums where people discussed caring for aging spouses and asked anonymous questions about medication management. 3 weeks before I'd overheard that phone call, Richard had attempted to take out a $2 million life insurance policy on me, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. He'd even forged my signature on the application. The insurance company had flagged it as suspicious and denied the claim. But Richard had tried. He'd actually tried to profit from my death before it even happened. Martin closed the file and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. It was something between fury and he asked me the question that still makes me laugh. He wanted to know if Richard really had no idea who I was. If my husband of 18 years genuinely believed I was just a retired legal secretary with no resources, no connections, no power. I confirmed it. 18 years, and Richard had never once asked for details about my career. He'd never questioned why I had such a nice home or how I afforded our lifestyle. He'd simply assumed I was exactly what he needed me to be: weak, naive, and temporary. Martin sat back in his chair and smiled. It was the smile I remembered from when we used to dismantle complex fraud cases together. That moment when we both realized we had everything we needed to win. He said, just for words, "Let's educate him then." I left Martin's office that afternoon with a plan already forming. Richard thought he was waiting for a helpless old woman to die naturally so he could inherit a modest estate. He had no idea he was living with someone who'd spent for decades perfecting the art of destroying men exactly like him. The irony was so delicious I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence or building the legal case. The hardest part was going home every single night and pretending I still loved the man who was planning my death. I'd wake up next to Richard and watch him sleep, wondering which morning he'd decide to put too many pills in my medication organizer. I'd pour his coffee and think about how he was probably calculating whether my life insurance, one he didn't know I'd canceled 6 years ago, would pay out if I had a convenient accident. Every kiss on my cheek felt like a countdown timer ticking in my ear. But I smiled. I laughed at his jokes. I held his hand during our evening walks around the neighborhood, because I needed him comfortable. I needed him confident that his harmless old wife suspected absolutely nothing. Martin and I met twice a week at a coffee shop across town, always when Richard thought I was at book club or getting my hair done. We were documenting everything, methodically building a case so airtight that Richard wouldn't be able to lie his way out, even if he tried. Martin had contacts at the FBI who were very interested in the forged insurance application. Fraud across state lines, federal crime, the kind of thing that came with serious prison time. But I wanted more than just criminal charges. I wanted Richard to understand exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. I wanted him to see the moment when his entire fantasy collapsed. And that required patience. So I played my part perfectly. Better than perfectly. Actually, I became the wife Richard needed me to be. Fragile. Forgetful. Just helpless enough to make him feel secure. I started asking Richard to help me with simple tasks I'd been doing myself for decades. Could he program the new coffee maker because the buttons confused me? Could he remind me what day trash pickup was? I made small mistakes, put the milk in the pantry once, forgot where I'd parked at the grocery store. Nothing alarming, just enough to reinforce his belief that I was declining, that nature was doing his work for him. Richard ate it up. I could see the relief in his eyes every time I appeared a little more confused, a little more dependent. He started being extra attentive, extra sweet. He'd pat my hand and tell me not to worry, that he'd take care of everything. The tenderness in his voice made me want to vomit. David started coming around more often too. I'd insisted we should see more of Richard's dear friend, said I felt guilty for not being more welcoming all these years. Now David was at our house twice a week, drinking our wine, eating meals I cooked, sitting on furniture I'd paid for while secretly planning my husband's future without me. I watched them carefully during those dinners. The way they'd glance at each other when they thought I wasn't looking. How David's hand would linger just a second too long on Richard's shoulder when he'd get up to refill drinks. The private smiles they'd exchange when I'd say something they found adorably naive. One night, about 6 weeks into my investigation, we were all having dinner on the back patio. I'd made Richard's favorite grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. David had brought an expensive bottle of wine, probably purchased with money from his ongoing divorce settlement. They were both relaxed, laughing, talking about some fishing trip they wanted to take together. I excused myself to get dessert from the kitchen, but I stayed just inside the door where I could hear them through the screen. David's voice dropped low, asking Richard how much longer he thought they'd have to wait. Richard sighed and said, I seem to be getting more forgetful lately, that maybe my heart condition was getting worse. David asked if Richard had made any progress on the insurance situation. Richard said no, that the company had been difficult, but it didn't matter because he'd inherit the house anyway. And even if it was mortgaged, they could sell it and start over somewhere warm. Then David said something that made my hands tighten around the dessert plates. He told Richard he was proud of him for being so patient, that not every man could handle being married to someone he didn't love for this long. That Richard was a better actor than he'd ever given him credit for. Richard left and said acting wasn't that hard when you kept your eye on the prize. I stood there in my own kitchen, holding tiramisu I'd spent 2 hours making, listening to my husband describe our 18-year marriage as a performance, a means to an end, a role he'd played to access resources he thought I had. The universe has a sense of humor, doesn't it? Because Richard was absolutely right, this marriage was a performance. He just had no idea which one of us was the better actor. I walked back outside with the brightest smile I could manage and served them both generous portions of dessert. I told them how happy it made me to see them together, to know that Richard had such a devoted friend in his life. David actually reached over and squeezed my hand, told me I was sweet to be so understanding of their friendship. I squeezed back and said that friendship was one of life's greatest treasures, especially as we got older and time became more precious. Richard smiled at me with what I'm sure he thought was affection. He had absolutely no idea that I just heard him confess to 18 years of calculated deception, no idea that every word he'd spoken on that patio was being recorded by the device Martin had helped me plant in the outdoor speaker system. No idea that his harmless, forgetful old wife had just obtained another piece of evidence that would destroy him. As I watched them eat dessert and plan their future together, I thought about something I'd learned in 41 years on the bench. The most dangerous opponent isn't the one who threatens you openly. It's the one who smiles while they document every single mistake you make. Richard had spent 18 years thinking he was the predator in this marriage. He was about to learn he'd been the prey all along. Martin called me on a Tuesday morning while Richard was supposedly meeting with a client. He asked if I could come to his office immediately, said he'd found something I needed to see in person. The tone in his voice told me it was big. I drove downtown with my heart hammering in my chest, trying to imagine what could be worse than what I already knew. How do you top a husband planning your death with his secret lover? Turns out, you add evidence that they'd done this before. Martin had dug deeper into Richard's past, specifically into his first wife Patricia's death. She'd died of what was ruled natural causes heart failure related to her cancer treatment. But Martin had found Patricia's medical records, and something didn't add up. Her oncologist had noted in several appointments that Patricia complained about feeling worse after taking medication her husband prepared for her. The doctor had chalked it up to chemotherapy, side effects, and depression. But there was a life insurance policy, $500,000 that Richard had taken out on Patricia just 8 months before she died. And in the 3 weeks before her death, Richard had filled her prescriptions at 3 different pharmacies, something the insurance investigator at the time had noted as unusual but not prosecutable. Martin slid another document across his desk. David had visited Patricia in the hospital twice during her final week. He'd signed in as Richard's best friend, come to offer support. The nursing notes mentioned that David had been alone with Patricia for 30 minutes on his second visit, that she'd seemed agitated afterward but couldn't articulate why. I felt sick. Not just about what Richard had done to me, but about what he might have done to his first wife. A woman who'd trusted him, who'd been vulnerable and dying, who'd never known her husband might have been accelerating her death. Martin told me the FBI was already looking into it. They couldn't prove anything yet. Patricia had been cremated, no autopsy, and it had been over 20 years. But the pattern was there. The life insurance, the pharmacy hopping, the suspicious visits from David, and now, 20 years later, Richard was following the exact same playbook with me. I asked Martin what we needed to do next. His answer was simple. We needed to make sure Richard couldn't walk away from this. We needed leverage that would guarantee consequences, not just for fraud and conspiracy, but for everything he'd done. That's when Martin told me about his contact at the FBI special agent Diana Chun. Yes, Chun, David's ex. I stared at Martin, certain I'd miss her. But no, David's divorce had been with an FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes. Diana had suspected for years that David was involved in something illegal, but she'd never been able to prove it. She'd walked away from the marriage with nothing except her suspicions and her career intact. When Martin reached out to her about my case and mentioned David's name, Diana had volunteered immediately to help with the investigation. The ex-wife of my husband's lover was now working with us to take them both down. I would have laughed if the situation weren't so devastating. Diana came to Martin's office that afternoon. She was 52, sharp as a blade, with eyes that had seen too many liars. She shook my hand and told me she was sorry for what I was going through, but she was also grateful. She'd spent 7 years married to David, watching him manipulate and lie, knowing he was hiding something major but never quite catching him. Now, she finally had her chance. Diana laid out what the FBI had so far. The forged insurance application was solid fraud. The electronic trail of Richard and David's communications was extensive years of emails, texts, photos. They'd been sloppy because they'd felt safe, because they thought no one was watching. But the conspiracy to commit murder charge would be harder. We had Richard's online searches and his discussions with David about accelerating my death, but a defense attorney could argue it was just dark talk, not actual intent. Diana said we needed Richard to make a concrete move. We needed him to do something undeniable that showed he was actively trying to harm me. I understood what she was asking, and it terrified me. She wanted me to stay in that house, keep playing the fragile old wife, and wait for Richard to actually try something. Wait for him to tamper with my medication or sabotage something or make a move that we could catch in real time. Martin saw the fear on my face and immediately offered alternatives. We could arrest Richard now on the fraud charges, he said. It wouldn't be as airtight, but it would get him away from me. ADB? Safe. But I thought about Patricia, about how Richard had walked away from her death with $500,000 and no consequences, about how he'd found me 3 years later and done it all over again, about how many other women there might have been that we didn't know about, or how many there might be in the future if we didn't stop him completely. I told Diana I'd do it. I'd stay in the house and wait for Richard to make his move. But I wanted protection cameras, monitoring, some way to make sure that if Richard tried something, we'd have him dead to rights. Diana nodded and said she'd have a team install surveillance equipment within 48 hours. Cameras disguised as smoke detectors, audio devices in every room, a panic button I could wear as a necklace that would bring agents to my house in under 3 minutes. They'd be watching everything, she promised. I wouldn't be alone. We spent the next 2 hours planning every detail, where the cameras would go, how I'd signal if I felt unsafe, what kinds of scenarios might unfold and how we'd respond. Diana coached me on what to say and not say, how to react if Richard did something suspicious, how to preserve evidence without tipping him off. As I was leaving Martin's office that evening, Diana stopped me at the door. She looked at me with something like admiration and told me I was braver than most people she'd worked with, that what I was doing, staying in that house, playing that role, waiting for a man to potentially try to kill me, took a special kind of courage. I told her it wasn't courage. It was something I'd learned in 41 years of being a judge. Sometimes justice requires you to let the defendant hang themselves with their own rope. You give them just enough freedom to make the fatal mistake, and then you close the trap. Richard thought he was so close to winning. He could practically taste his future with David, free from the burden of his fake marriage to a woman he'd never loved. He had no idea that his harmless, declining old wife had just recruited an FBI agent and built a surveillance net that would capture his every move. The prey had become the hunter, and I was about to give Richard all the rope he needed. The FBI installed the surveillance equipment on a Thursday while Richard was out of town at what he claimed was a financial conference in Chicago. Diana's team worked like ghosts in and out in 4 hours, leaving no trace. Smoke detectors with hidden cameras. A clock radio in the bedroom with audio recording. Motion sensors disguised as air. Every room in my house was now a monitored zone. Diana gave me a thin gold necklace with a small pendant. It looked like a simple locket, the kind an old woman might wear with her late husband's photo inside. But the pendant had a button that would alert the FBI and send agents to my door within minutes. She made me promise to wear it every single day, even to sleep. I promised. Richard came home Friday evening with flowers and apologies about the boring conference. He seemed energized, almost giddy. He kissed my cheek and suggested we have David over for dinner the next night, said he had some exciting news to share with both of us. I agreed with a smile, even as ice water ran through my veins. Richard never had exciting news, and he certainly never wanted to share anything with both me and David unless it served some purpose. That Saturday dinner will stay with me forever. I made pot roast, Richard's comfort meal from childhood. David arrived with champagne expensive, the kind you bring to celebrate something major. They were both practically vibrating with contained energy. We ate dinner making small talk. The weather, local news, David's ongoing divorce proceedings, which he claimed were finally reaching a conclusion. Richard kept glancing at David with this look of barely controlled excitement. I played my part, perfectly the oblivious wife, happy just to have company, pleased that the two most important men in my life were getting along so well. After dinner, as I was clearing plates, Richard stopped me. He said I should sit down, that he and David had something they wanted to discuss with me. His voice had that careful, gentle tone you use with children or elderly relatives you think might not understand complex information. I sat, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. Richard started talking about his financial consulting work, how he'd been doing some calculations about our future. He said that given my age and health concerns, I wanted to ask, but I stayed quiet. We needed to think seriously about estate planning. He'd been doing research, he said, and he really thought we should simplify things, consolidate accounts, make sure everything was in order. So when the time came and he said this like he was being so considerate the transition would be easy for him to manage. David nodded along, like this was the most reasonable conversation in the world. He even added that Richard had been so worried about me, so concerned about making sure I was protected. What good friends they were, looking out for my well-being. Richard pulled out papers he'd printed, a new will he'd found online, power of attorney documents, forms to add him to my bank accounts, transfer my property deed to joint ownership, make him beneficiary on everything. All prepared, just needing my signature. He slid the papers across the table to me with a pen and that same gentle, condescending smile. This was it. This was Richard's move. He wasn't going to tamper with my medication or stage an accident. He was going to get me to sign over everything legally, and then I didn't want to think about what came after that. How long would I have lasted once Richard had full access to accounts he thought contained my life savings? How convenient would my death have been once he controlled everything? I looked down at the papers, my heart pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. I picked up the pen with a hand I made tremble just slightly. I asked Richard in my sweetest, most confused voice if he was sure this was necessary. Didn't we already have everything arranged? Richard's voice got even softer, more patient. He told me that things change, that at my age I needed someone younger to handle the complicated financial matters. He said he'd take care of everything, that I wouldn't have to worry about a single thing. All I had to do was sign, and he'd make sure everything was perfect. David chimed in that Richard was so good at this sort of thing that I was lucky to have someone so devoted to managing these details for me. I looked at both of them sitting at my dinner table, in my house, eating food I'd cooked, trying to manipulate me into signing away everything I'd built over 76 years of life, trying to trick me into making myself financially helpless right before they disposed of me. The rage that rose up in me was almost overwhelming, but I kept it buried beneath layers of performance. Because I knew Diana was watching through the camera in the smoke detector above the dining room table, I knew every word was being recorded. I knew Richard and David were digging their own graves with every lie that came out of their mouths. I picked up the papers and looked at them carefully. I took my chimney, squinting, like my eyes weren't what they used to be. And then I did something that must have made Diana's team hold their breath. I asked Richard if we could do this another time. I said the paperwork looked complicated, that I wanted to understand it better before signing. Maybe we could review it with our lawyer, just to be Safi. Richard's face tightened for just a fraction of a second. He recovered quickly, but I saw it, the flash of frustration, the barely controlled anger that his plan was being delayed. He told me there was no need for a lawyer, that this was all standard stuff. He actually reached over and put his hand on mine, applied just a little bit of pressure, and said it would really put his mind at ease if we could just get this handled tonight. For his peace of mind. Because he worried about me so much. That pressure on my hand, that was threat disguised as concern. That was the real Richard showing through the mask. I pulled my hand back gently and said I was tired, that maybe I wasn't thinking clearly. Could we please discuss it tomorrow after I'd had some rest? The look that passed between Richard and David in that moment told me everything I needed to know. They were running out of patience. Whatever timeline they'd set for themselves was getting close. They needed me to sign those papers, and they needed it soon. David stood up abruptly, said he should get going, that it was getting late. Richard walked him to the door while I stayed at the table, staring at those papers covered in legal language designed to strip me of everything I'd protected for 18 years. When Richard came back, his whole demeanor had changed. The gentle, patient husband was gone. He told me in a voice that was just slightly too sharp that we'd discuss this again tomorrow, that it really couldn't wait much longer. Then he went upstairs without helping me clean up, something he'd never done before. I stood in my kitchen, loading the dishwasher, and I knew we were close to the end. Richard was getting desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Just 3 words, "We got everything." I looked up at the smoke detector camera and gave the smallest nod. Every word, every manipulation, every threat disguised as concern. All recorded and documented by the FBI. Richard thought he was pressuring a confused old woman to sign away her assets. He had no idea he was performing his own confession for a federal investigation. The trap was set. All we needed now was the right moment to spring it. And I knew exactly when that moment would be. I spent Sunday morning watching Richard pace around the house like a caged animal. He was on his phone constantly, stepping outside to take calls I knew were with David. When he thought I wasn't looking, his face showed something I'd never seen before, pure, undisguised frustration. The mask was slipping. At breakfast, he brought up the papers again. He tried the gentle approach first, telling me he'd been thinking about it all night, that he really felt we needed to get this settled for my protection. When I hesitated, his voice got harder. He said I was being unreasonable, that Achimayaji I needed to accept that I couldn't handle these things alone anymore. I told him I'd made a decision. I wanted to meet with a lawyer together, the 3 of us to review everything properly, just to be soft. Richard's jaw tightened, but he agreed. He asked Juan. I told him I'd already called an old colleague who could meet us Friday evening at our house. I said I hoped that was okay, that I'd invited David too since Richard seemed to want him involved in our financial planning. Richard's eyes flickered with something between suspicion and calculation, but he probably figured a small-town lawyer wouldn't catch anything, that he could charm or manipulate his way through the meeting. Or maybe he was just relieved I was moving forward at all. What Richard didn't know was that my old colleague was Martin Kozłowski, federal prosecutor turned defense attorney. And David's invitation wasn't courtesy, it was strategy. We wanted both of them in the same room when everything came crashing down. The next 4 days were the longest of my life. Richard's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd be sweet one moment, asking if I needed anything, making me tea. Then he'd snap at me for forgetting something minor, his anger flashing before he'd catch himself and apologize. He was under pressure. Diana had her team monitoring his communications, and apparently David was pushing them hard, asking why this was taking so long, suggesting that maybe Richard didn't have as much control over his wife as he'd claimed. Wednesday night, I caught Richard in the bathroom with my pill organizer. He said he was just helping me sort my medication for the week, being thoughtful, but his hands were shaking, and there were pills on the counter that didn't belong there. I thanked him sweetly and told him I'd already done it earlier. Diana's team analyzed the surveillance footage. Richard had been trying to add extra doses of my blood pressure medication, Inafet, to potentially cause a dangerous drop that could lead to a fall or worse. He was past manipulation now. He was moving toward direct action. Thursday, I called Martin and told him we needed to move the meeting up. I didn't feel safe anymore. The look in Richard's eyes had changed. He was looking at me the way you look at an obstacle that needs to be removed. Martin agreed immediately. He contacted Diana, and they accelerated everything. The meeting would happen Friday at 7 p.m. as planned, but it wouldn't be the meeting Richard was expecting. Friday morning, Richard was almost cheerful. He made me breakfast for the first time in months. He told me how proud he was that I was being so responsible about our future, how much easier this would make everything. He actually hugged me and said he'd take care of me for as long as I needed. For as long as I needed. Not for as long as I lived. The distinction was chilling. I spent the day preparing. I cooked Richard's favorite meal, standing rib roast, roasted potatoes, green beans. I set the dining room table with our good china. I put on a nice dress and the pearl necklace James had given me on our 20th anniversary. And around my neck, hidden beneath the pearls, was Diana's panic button. David arrived at 6:30 with another expensive bottle of champagne. Richard answered the door and I heard them speaking in low, excited voices in the hallway. When they came into the dining room, they were both smiling like men who thought they were about to win the lottery. Mart arrived exactly at 7, carrying a leather briefcase. I introduced him to Richard and David as Martin, my old colleague from the law office where I used to work. Martin played his part perfectly, rumpled, friendly, informal, just a small-town lawyer helping an old friend with some paperwork. Richard visibly relaxed. We sat down to dinner. I served the roast while Richard poured champagne. David made a toast to new beginnings and smart financial planning. They were practically giddy. Halfway through the meal, Martin set down his fork and said he had a question for Richard, just something that had been bothering him since he'd reviewed the paperwork. He asked Richard, in the most casual voice imaginable, how long he'd been a financial consultant. Richard launched into his usual story: 15 years of independent consulting, portfolio of satisfied clients, specialized in retirement planning. He was smooth, confident, well-rehearsed. Martin nodded along, then asked another question. He wondered if Richard could explain why his business license had been revoked in 3 states, or why he'd been fired from 2 insurance companies for ethics violations. The dining room went completely silent. Richard's face drained of color. David set down his glass carefully, his hand trembling. Martin kept going, his voice still friendly and conversational. He mentioned that he'd also found it interesting that Richard had taken out a life insurance policy on his first wife 8 months before she died, and had tried to do the same with me using a forged signature. He said it was the forged signature part that really caught the FBI's attention. Richard stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He said he didn't know what kind of game this was, but he was leaving. David started to stand too. That's when I spoke for the first time since dinner began. I told them both to sit down. My voice wasn't the soft, confused, elderly woman voice anymore. It was the voice I'd used for 41 years on the federal bench, the voice that made lawyers and defendants freeze. They sat. I looked at Richard across the table, the man I'd shared a bed with for 18 years, the man who'd been planning my death, and I told him the truth. I told him I wasn't a retired legal secretary. I was the Honorable Victoria Crane, federal judge, retired after 4 decades on the bench, specializing in matrimonial fraud, conspiracy, and financial manipulation. I told him Martin wasn't just a lawyer, he was a federal prosecutor I'd worked with for 30 years. We had a conviction rate of 97%, and we'd destroyed men far smarter than Richard. Richard tried to speak, but I held up my hand. I wasn't finished. I told him I'd known about him and David for 3 months. I'd heard every phone call, read every email, seen every hotel receipt. I knew they'd been together for 23 years. I knew about the debt he'd hidden. I knew about Patricia and what he'd likely done to her. And I knew about his recent attempt to manipulate me into signing over assets I'd never actually given him access to. David looked like he might throw up. Richard's mouth was opening and closing, but no sound was coming out. Then I delivered the final blow. I told Richard he'd spent 18 years sleeping next to one of the most respected legal minds in the country. Thinking I was a helpless secretary, he'd planned my death while living in a house I owned, spending money I earned, eating food I paid for, and every single asset he thought he'd inherit, protected in trusts I'd established before we ever met. He was never going to inherit a single dollar from me. Martin opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. He told Richard that the FBI had been investigating him for the last 2 months. The forged insurance application was federal fraud. The conspiracy with David to accelerate my death was attempted murder. The pattern with Patricia was being reviewed for potential charges. The documents Richard had tried to get me to sign would have added financial elder abuse to the list. Martin slid papers across the table. Arrest warrants, both their names. That's when Diana Chun walked through my front door with 3 other FBI agents. David recognized her immediately and made a sound like a wounded animal. Richard just stared at her in complete shock. Diana introduced herself formally, and I watched Richard's face as he realized that David's ex-wife, the woman he'd probably helped David betray and manipulate, was an FBI agent who'd been coordinating my case. Diana informed them both that they were under arrest. She read them their rights while agents handcuffed them in my dining room, next to a half-eaten roast I'd spent hours preparing. Before they took Richard away, I stood up and walked over to where he sat, hands cuffed behind his back, face gray with shock. I looked down at the man who'd thought he could outwit me, outlast me, and ultimately erase me. I told him one last thing, that his biggest mistake wasn't the fraud, or the conspiracy, or even the attempted murder. His biggest mistake was assuming that a quiet woman was a powerless woman, that an old woman was a foolish woman, that a secretary was somehow less than a judge. Richard looked up at me, and I saw the exact moment he understood the full scope of what he'd done. He hadn't just underestimated me, he'd spent 18 years sleeping next to someone who could destroy him with a single phone call, and he'd never once asked the right questions. Diana's agents led them both out of my house in handcuffs. Through my front door, down the steps I'd climbed alone for 18 years, into separate police cars that would take them to holding cells where they'd spend the night contemplating exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. As the cars pulled away, Martin put his hand on my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I looked around my dining room, the table still set with good china, the roast going cold, the champagne David had brought to celebrate what he thought would be my manipulation into signing away my life, and I realized I was more than okay. For the first time in 3 months, I was free. The silence in my house that night was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. After Martin and Diana left, after the FBI finished collecting evidence and the dinner table had been cleared, I sat alone in my living room with a cup of tea and just breathed. No more pretending. No more watching over my shoulder. No more sleeping next to someone who was counting down the days until I died. Just silence and safety and the kind of peace I hadn't felt in 3 months. Richard and David were arraigned the following Monday. Martin called to walk me through everything that was happening. Both of them had been denied bail. The attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud charges were serious enough that the judge considered them flight risks. Rich's fancy lawyer tried to argue that his client was a respectable businessman, but the prosecutor presented the evidence we'd gathered, and the lawyer's face went pale. They offered Richard a deal: plead guilty to fraud, conspiracy, and attempted financial elder abuse, accept 7 years in federal prison, and cooperate fully with the investigation into Patricia's death. If he took it to trial and lost, he was looking at 25 years minimum. Richard took the deal. He had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged insurance documents, the recorded conversations about waiting for me to die, the surveillance footage of him tampering with my medication, his own emails discussing how to accelerate my death. David got a similar offer of 5 years as an accomplice to fraud and conspiracy. Diana told me he cried during his arraignment, kept saying he'd just been following Richard's lead, that he'd never actually wanted anyone hurt. Diana said she smiled at him from the prosecutor's table and reminded him that the jury would see every email he'd sent talking about their future together after I was gone. He took the deal too. The divorce was finalized within 6 weeks. Richard didn't contest anything he couldn't really, since Martin had documented that Richard never had any legal claim to any of my assets in the first place. The house was mine. The accounts were mine. Everything had always been mine. Richard walked away with nothing except his debt and his prison sentence. But the legal consequences weren't the most satisfying part. That came about 2 months after the arrest. When the story hit the news, a local reporter had been covering the court proceedings and realized who I actually was. Retired federal judge outsmarts husband's murder plot was the headline. It went viral. Within 48 hours, I was getting interview requests from major news outlets, true crime podcasts, even a streaming service that wanted to option my story. I declined most of them. I'm a private person, always have been. But I did agree to one interview with a legal journal I'd read for 40 years. I wanted other women to hear this story. I wanted them to understand that age doesn't equal helplessness, that quietness doesn't mean ignorance, that underestimating someone is the fastest way to lose to them. The interviewer asked me how I'd stayed so calm during those 3 months of investigation, how I'd managed to sleep in the same house with someone plotting my death. I told her the truth. 41 years on the bench teaches you how to compartmentalize fear and focus on strategy. I'd faced down murderers, crime bosses, and corrupt officials in my courtroom. Richard was just another criminal who thought he was smarter than everyone else. She asked if I was angry, if I felt betrayed. I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Yes, I told her. I was angry. Angry about the 18 years I'd wasted on a man who'd never loved me. Angry about the trust I'd extended that had been thrown back in my face. Angry about Patricia, who died never knowing her husband had betrayed her. But more than angry, I was sad. Sad that Richard had looked at a 76-year-old woman and seen only a target. Sad that he'd been so consumed by greed and selfishness that he'd missed the chance to actually know me, the real me. Not the character he'd invented in his head. The interviewer's last question was what I'd learned from all of this. I told her I'd learned that the assumptions we make about people based on their age, their gender, their job title, or their quietness are often the assumptions that destroy us. Richard assumed a retired secretary couldn't possibly be a threat. He never asked about my past because he didn't think it mattered. He saw gray hair and wrinkles and decided I was invisible, irrelevant, already halfway to the grave. He couldn't have been more wrong. 3 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd wasted nearly 2 decades on a man who'd never seen me as anything more than a means to an end. I thought I'd been foolish to trust, naive to hope for companionship in my later years. But sitting here now, in my home, truly my home, with no one plotting against me, no one waiting for me to die, realize something important. I didn't waste 18 years. I protected myself for 18 years. Every decision I made to keep my assets separate, every choice to maintain my privacy about my career, every instinct that told me to be careful, those weren't signs of distrust. They were signs of wisdom earned through decades of seeing the worst of human nature. Richard thought he was conning a helpless old woman. In reality, he was living with someone who'd spent a lifetime learning how to identify, document, and destroy people exactly like him. The irony is almost poetic. I'm 76 years old now, soon to be. I spend my days working in my garden, reading case law just to keep my mind sharp, and volunteering with a legal aid clinic that helps elderly victims of financial abuse. I've helped 4 women in the past 2 months escape situations similar to mine, women whose families or partners were trying to manipulate them, steal from them, or worse. Those women come to me frightened and ashamed, thinking they've been foolish. I tell them what I wish someone had told me sooner. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Never let anyone make you feel powerless just because you've lived a long life. Age is experience, and experience is the most powerful weapon you can have. Swami, evenings. I sit on my back patio, the same patio where Richard and David planned their future without me, and I think about James, my first husband, the love of my life, who died 20 years ago and left me heartbroken but protected. James always told me my intelligence was my greatest asset. He was right. I miss James every day, but I don't regret the 18 years with Richard. Strange as that sounds, those years taught me that I'm stronger than I ever knew, that I can face down evil with patience and strategy, that I can play a role when I need to, smile through heartbreak when necessary, and strike with precision when the moment is right. Richard is serving his 7 years in a federal facility in Pennsylvania. David is in Ohio. Diana told me they're not allowed contact with each other, part of their plea agreements. I imagine them in their separate cells, finally forced to face the consequences of their choices, unable to blame anyone else or plan their next scheme. I hope they think about Patricia sometimes. I hope they think about me. I hope they spend every single day of their sentences understanding that the women they underestimated were the ones who destroyed them. As for me, I'm doing more than surviving. I'm thriving. I'm traveling. I went to Italy last month, something I'd always wanted to do but Richard had always said was too expensive. I'm reconnecting with old colleagues from my years on the bench. I'm writing a book about financial abuse of the elderly, hoping to help other women recognize the warning signs before it's too late. And most importantly, I'm living my life on my own terms, surrounded by people who actually know me, respect me, and value me for who I am, not for what they think they can take from me. The house is quieter now. There's no one here but me. But it's not a lonely quiet. It's a peaceful quiet, the quiet of a woman who fought back and won. The quiet of a 76-year-old judge who proved that wisdom beats manipulation, patience beats greed, and underestimating your opponent is the fastest way to lose everything. My name is Victoria Crane. I'm 76 years old, and I survived a murder plot by being exactly who I've always been: smarter, stronger, and far more dangerous than anyone expected. To everyone who's been following this journey with me, thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. This story isn't just meant for every woman who's been underestimated, dismissed, or treated as invisible because of her age. We see everything. We remember everything, and we are far more powerful than anyone realizes. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know where you're hearing it from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you want to make sure you don't miss other stories like mine, stories of survival and justice and women who refuse to be victims, consider subscribing. There are more stories to tell, and every one of them matters. Remember, age is not weakness. Silence is not ignorance. And a quiet woman watching carefully is the most dangerous opponent you'll ever face. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Now, go live your lives boldly, protect yourselves wisely, and never, ever let anyone make you feel powerless. You are stronger than you know.